Aside from Japan, it's been a while since the rest of the world had an excuse to revisit the Ace Attorney universe. To Capcom's credit, there was a re-release of Phoenix Wright's original trilogy for almost every console under the sun, but admitting that, the latest chronological release was Spirit of Justice on the 3DS, dating back half a decade. Now before that, Ace Attorney had a collection of titles that never made it outside Japan, like Gyakuten Kenji 2, featuring everybody's favourite fluttery cravat-wearing prosecutor, and the spin-off duology, Gyakuten Saiban, which originally dropped on the 3DS as far as 6 years ago. Now, in the interest of this review, allow me to focus your attention on the latter, which by this week will officially have a localized release, now known as the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, available on Steam, Nintendo Switch, and PlayStation 4. Now, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is a compilation of two directly narratively linked games, respectively titled The Great Ace Attorney Adventures and The Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve. These two titles document the judicial and investigative exploits of protagonist Ryunosuke Naruhodo across a total of 10 major cases. Not only is he a great ancestor of series mainstay Phoenix Wright, but the adventures of Ryunosuke as a fledgling defense attorney runs parallel with the infancy of Japan's modernized legal system and increasing exposure to other cultures during the end of the Meiji period in the 19th century. In order to reform Japan's attitudes on prosecution and improve national relations with Great Britain, Ryunosuke travels to London and studies law, picking up a good amount of on-the-job experience and meeting a colourful cast of Britain's inhabitants along the way. Since a good majority of the Great Ace Attorney takes place in ye olde Britain, the general tone of its music and visuals are shifted significantly from what you normally hear from the mainline installments, aligning itself with the game's chronological placement. The synth and high-tempo tracks, synonymous with modern-day Ace Attorney, are replaced by a more dignified, grand orchestra approach to its sound design, peppered with some traditional Japanese instruments like the taiko and koto. It fits the game's amalgamation of Western and Eastern culture like a glove, and due to sharing the same composer, Yasumasa Kitagawa, feels reminiscent of Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright, which graced the 3DS almost a decade ago. Relative newcomer to the Capcom sound team, Hiromitsu Maeba, contributes a good amount to the soundtrack, known for their work with Devil May Cry 5 as well as Monster Hunter Stories, and knocks the more refined and slower tempo pieces out of the park, to help round out an excellent soundtrack for each game in the compilation. It's also a relief to know that the game looks as well as it sounds, even when the game's been optimized for bigger screens, this time around. The user interface is clean, the text sharp, and characters are extremely well realized from the main cast all the way to the witnesses and jurors. In motion, the game sports some excellent animations. The rigidity of the models found in previous 3D-based Ace Attorneys are gone, and it feels as if the studio got a lot more comfortable pulling off zany expressions thanks to some clever use of motion capture and visual foreshadowing. It's pretty hard to not smile when famed British detective Sherlock Holmes is prancing around the crime scene like the gifted moron he is, or when the judge is adjusting his peruke after a heated exchange between defense and prosecution. As for the environments, they zig and zag to the extremes as you navigate some of Britain's coziest interiors and gloomiest steampunk-inspired nooks. Unfortunately, this is where the game shows its age the most, as there's the occasional strange texture, particularly if you're playing on a larger TV in Doctor Mode. Now, it's understandable since there's only so much you can do with a game originally designed for a screen as small as the one you would find on a 3DS, but they're good enough when it counts the most, like on the many objects and evidence you examine within the court record. Now, if you're playing on Switch, the easiest way to overcome this is to play in handheld mode, which is perfect for a game like this. Or bump it down to a lower resolution if you're playing on any other platform, but aside from that, it's thankfully as minor as gripes can get. For those who might not have played an Ace Attorney game before, each game can be divided into two halves. The first sequence is investigation, and as the name would suggest, it involves collecting evidence and becoming familiar with locations relevant to cases that the player takes on. Not only that, but the investigation sequences are integral to world building, establishing the very eclectic cast of characters along with their supposed motives and personality. The other sequence is the trial period, where aforementioned information collected in the investigation segment is tested via a series of cross-examinations, recounting key components of evidence, and using findings to formulate a compelling defense for your client. Thankfully, this is all easier said than done, where most of the dialogue is presented through a visual novel format, and the game periodically stops here and there when a witness requires cross-examination, or evidence is required to support or debunk theories brought forward from the defense or the prosecution, respectively. As is with most Ace Attorney games, there are mechanics that separate themselves from the rest of the pack, and this trend is continued with the Great Ace Attorney Adventures. During the investigation sections of each game, Detective Sherlock Holmes can get a little too giddy with his world-famous logical deductions, so as Yunosuke, the player can chip in and correct the course of reasoning to clear the way for plausible theories and hidden evidence. On the flip side, during trials, the judge takes a more passive approach and allows a jury of public members to decide the fate of the accused. If all jury members collectively agree on a guilty verdict, a summation examination takes place, where conflicting emotions and decisions of each juror can be used to pit them against each other and sway public opinion. Overall, it's a great way to mix the system up mechanically and works seamlessly with the satirical nature of Ace Attorney in general. The series is no stranger to riffing on the ruthlessness of the Japanese judicial system, though with the Great Ace Attorney, there's a razor-sharp focus on the dangers of vigilantism, romanticization, and exoticism, as Japan seeks to model their legal proceedings off a system that clearly isn't without its faults. While Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright incorporated a similar approach to emphasize the savagery of the Salem witch trials, it feels better implemented here, meshing well with the idea that despite all the hard evidence you have, all it takes is a good appeal to emotion for the courtroom tide to turn. Aside from its social commentary, Ace Attorney has always excelled at striking the right balance by making elements of the game extremely goofy to offset some of the serious notes. At times, this bleeds over to the plot of most Ace Attorney games, where some extremely illogical trains of thought are the correct way forward. Thankfully, most of the compilation plays it straight, as the Great Ace Attorney Adventures is simplistic yet effective in its approach, streamlining and minimizing the back and forth pixel hunting commonly found during the investigative sequences of other Ace Attorney games. This prevents the game from being bogged down by formalities, and feels better paced as a result. The first game in the compilation might disappoint those looking for a proper logic-bending challenge, but the second game ramps things up appropriately as far as difficulty is concerned. Now, if I were to really stretch for any negatives, there were a couple of quirks during my time with the first and second parts of the compilation. Though the investigation parts seem far more streamlined and better paced, the game doesn't feel as globetrotting as it makes itself to be. Cases based in Japan are restricted to the courtroom only, while areas of exploration within Britain are quite limited, with some locations and assets being reused in Part 2. To pile on in Part 2, dialogue is a little bit strange in this one, where there are a few anachronisms and slang terms that definitely would not have been used by Japanese students learning English. But as far as the history of localizations go for Ace Attorney games, at least it's not at the level of Apollo Eat Your Hamburgers. And that counts for something, right? Right? Okay, moving on. So thankfully, those are the very few valleys of Part 2, with the rest sporting incredible emotional and narrative peaks that make the playthrough well worth the 50 hours of gameplay. Seeing Yunosuke develop from a wide-eyed, nervous student into a confident attorney is wonderful to see in motion. The entire duology is such a steady yet strong journey, and you can't help but root for Yunosuke even when the going gets tough. The supporting cast is such an eclectic mix of stoicism and hilarity stemming from both fictional and real-life figures, it helps create a universe you want to get lost in for hours. One moment you're working alongside Inspector Gregson from the Sherlock Holmes universe to comb through a crime scene, then suddenly you're entering the courtroom wearing a disguise inspired by some of William Shakespeare's many works. One of the biggest strengths of the Great Ace Attorney is that it never knows when to stop being fun. And even if it's primarily a celebration of 19th century British culture, it doesn't shy away from being critical of it either. And finally, to sweeten the pot, the compilation pops in some extra content like additional costumes and extra episodes, now bundled into the compilation at no extra cost. This is compared to the releases of the other 3DS Ace Attorney games like Dual Destinies and Spirit of Justice, where they were sold separately as post-release DLC. The highlights would have to be the director's commentary that shows within the music player and the sets of character illustration renders, featuring some interesting insight on various design decisions made during development. The added cherry on top is that the special content will periodically unlock as you progress through each case in the game, so that you're not spoiled on any major plot points and reveals of characters or locations. This sets the gold standard on releasing compilations, especially when there have been a few re-releases of games over the last few months that could have done more in this space, though the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles manages to nail it right out of the park. Now at this point, this might not come as a complete surprise, but I couldn't recommend the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles enough. Before playing, a part of me was skeptical of how well it would have aged or benefited from a localization years down the track, but after finally experiencing it in its entirety, those doubts melted away quicker than Ouchie's hairline. Given that it's the first couple of games on the Ace Attorney timeline, it's much easier to get into if you were ever looking to get properly invested in the series. Aside from a few gags like semantic squabbling over differences between ladders and stepladders, along with some foreshadowing of future events, the Great Ace Attorney remains largely self-contained and user-friendly. For established fans of courtroom drama, this is a must-play. Now if you're looking for more reviews, previews, and gaming goodness, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more here at youtube.com/NewGamePlusTV. This has been Matt from New Game Plus, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.